We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Subscribe right now, hit that notification bell, turn on former CIA officer and FBI Special Agent Tracy Walder. Tracy, good morning to you, my friend. Thank you for your time early this morning. Do you find the timing of these latest ransom notes to be intentional? The same day Savannah returned to work. Much for having me, Marky. Yes, I absolutely find these to be intentional. This is a person that now for almost a month, 6 weeks, has waited to essentially put out another note. I think this is a person who sort of wants the fame, wants the discussion. On day 68 of the Nancy Guthrie disappearance, a single detail, quiet, buried, and largely ignored, began to move back to the center of the investigation. Not because it was new, but because someone finally said it out loud. For weeks, the public had been focused on everything else. The ransom notes sent to media outlets, the Bitcoin demands, the conflicting claims about whether Nancy was alive or not. Each new message pulled attention in a different direction. Each one created the sense that something was happening. But beneath all of that, one detail had remained almost completely untouched. Mexico, not as speculation, not as theory, but as a direct reference written into one of the earliest communications in the case. A location specific, geographically real, and sitting there from the very beginning. That is what changed the conversation, because once that detail is acknowledged, everything else has to be re-examined. Why was it there? Who put it there? And most importantly, why did it take so long for it to become part of the public discussion? According to reports, one of the earliest ransom notes included a reference to Sonora, a Mexican state located directly south of Tucson, less than 70 minutes away. Close enough that the distance does not feel abstract. Close enough that it becomes possible. And in cases like this, possibility matters because it defines where investigators look. It defines what they prioritize, and it defines how time is used. If a credible lead points in one direction, but attention moves in another, the gap between those two paths becomes critical. That is what makes this moment difficult. Not because the Mexico reference is confirmed, but because it existed early, quietly, and largely outside of public focus. A former federal agent later reviewed the wording of that note and raised concerns that it did not read like random noise. It was not vague, it was not general, it pointed somewhere real. And that is where the problem begins. Because if a message contains specific geographic information, investigators do not ignore it. They assess it, they test it, they decide how much weight it carries. And whatever decision is made, it shapes everything that follows. Which leads to the central question now being asked. Why was this not addressed publicly? There are only a few possibilities, and none of them are simple. The first is strategic silence. In some investigations, information is deliberately withheld, not to avoid action, but to protect it. If investigators believe a suspect may be monitoring coverage, revealing certain details can force that person to react, to move, to adjust, and in doing so, they may expose themselves. In that context, silence is not inaction. It is positioning. It is choosing not to reveal what you know so you can see what the other side does next. If that is what happened here, then the absence of public discussion around the Mexico reference may not mean it was ignored. It may mean it was being worked quietly behind the scenes, out of view. But there is another possibility, and it is harder to sit with. What if that detail was not prioritized? What if in the early stages of the case attention was pulled in too many directions? Because from the beginning, this investigation has not been clean. It has been layered, complicated, filled with competing signals, thousands of tips, multiple messages, contradictory claims. And when volume increases like that, something else happens. Focus becomes harder to maintain. Not because investigators are careless, but because the environment itself becomes unstable. Every new piece of information demands attention. Every lead has to be evaluated. And in that process, some details can lose visibility, even important ones. If that is what happened here, then the cost is not just confusion, it is time. And in a case like this, time is not neutral. It moves the situation forward, whether investigators are ready or not, which is why the number matters. 68 days, more than 2 months, no confirmed location, no identified suspect, no resolution, and now a detail from the beginning is being pulled back into focus. That is not how cases are supposed to unfold. Normally, investigations move from uncertainty toward clarity, from broad possibilities toward narrow conclusions. Here something different is happening. The case is expanding, not contracting. More questions are being introduced instead of answered. And that expansion creates pressure not just on investigators but on everyone involved. Because when a case reaches this point, the expectation shifts. People begin to ask not just what is known, but what has not been said and why. At the same time, another development began to reshape how the case is being understood. Reports emerged that investigators may now believe the earliest ransom notes were genuine. Not the later ones, not the messages sent to media outlets, but the original communications, the ones sent directly, the ones that came before the noise. If that is accurate, then it changes everything because it suggests that the person responsible may have communicated once, clearly, deliberately, and then stopped. And when someone does that, it creates a different kind of pattern. Not chaotic, not reactive, controlled, intentional. The kind of pattern that does not rely on repeated contact. The kind that says what it needs to say and then disappears. That is very different from what came later, because the later messages did not follow that structure. They multiplied, they shifted, they contradicted themselves, and over time, they began to feel less like information and more like interference. Which raises another question: if the early notes were real and the later ones were not, then what happened in between? How did the case move from something structured to something unstable? And more importantly, did that shift affect how the investigation moved? Because if the most important information was present at the beginning, then everything that followed has to be measured against that, not the other way around. And that brings the case back to where it started. A single night, a narrow window, a location that may have been identified early, but not fully understood until much later, and a decision, whether strategic or unintentional, that kept that detail out of public view. For now, that is where the case stands, between two possibilities. One where investigators have been quietly working a direction the public never saw, and another where a critical lead may not have been given the attention it required. Both lead to the same place, uncertainty, and a case that is still waiting for something to hold to understand where this case stands now. You have to go back not just to the beginning of the investigation, but to the beginning of that night, because everything that followed, the ransom notes, the media attention, the conflicting claims, the pressure on investigators, none of it exists without what happened inside that house in Tucson. And that part has never changed. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was not someone who moved freely without structure. She had a routine. She had medical needs. She had limitations that made independence more difficult, not less. That matters because when someone like Nancy disappears, the explanation is rarely simple, and it is almost never voluntary. On the evening of January 31st, she returned home after spending time with family. There was nothing unusual about that moment. No signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong, just a normal return. The kind of moment that happens every day and is usually forgotten by the next morning. But this one was different because sometime after she entered that home, something interrupted that normal pattern. And by the time February 1st began, the situation had already changed. Nancy was gone. Her phone was still inside. Her purse had not been taken. And for investigators, those details were not small. They were immediate indicators that something did not follow the expected pattern, because when someone leaves on their own, they take things with them. They create movement. They leave traces. Here, there was none. Instead, what they found pointed in a different direction, a direction that began outside the house, captured briefly and almost incidentally, but enough to change everything. A figure appeared near the front of the home, masked, covered, deliberate, not moving casually, not passing by, engaging with the property itself, and more specifically with the camera. The doorbell surveillance system. The one device that should have recorded everything that followed. Instead, it was disabled, interfered with, removed from the sequence. That detail is often mentioned quickly, but it should not be because it tells you something critical. It tells you that whoever approached that house knew exactly what they were doing. They did not arrive and react. They arrived with awareness. They identified the camera, and they dealt with it first. That is not random. That is not opportunistic. That is controlled behavior. And controlled behavior suggests preparation. Preparation suggests time. And time suggests that this was not a spontaneous event, that it may have been planned. That possibility becomes stronger when you consider what happened next. Because not long after the camera was disabled, something else stopped working. NY's pacemaker monitoring connection. Now this is not just a technical detail. This is a medical lifeline, a system designed to track her condition to provide continuity to ensure that any change in her health could be detected. And suddenly it was gone, disconnected, silent, two systems independent, both going offline within the same narrow window. That is not coincidence. That is sequence. And when investigators see sequence like that, they begin to build a timeline. Not a broad one, a precise one, and a narrow window where something happened, something controlled, something that unfolded quickly, but not randomly. Inside the house, the scene reinforced that NY's belongings were still there. Her phone, her purse, items that would normally travel with her, left behind. That suggests she did not leave on her own terms, that she did not have time to prepare, that whatever happened happened fast, but not without direction. Reports later confirmed that the back doors of the house were found open. That detail matters because it introduces movement, not just presence, but exit, a path, a direction away from the scene. And outside there was something else. Blood identified as NY's. That detail changed everything because it removed any remaining possibility that this was a simple disappearance. It confirmed that something physical had occurred, something that left a mark, something that connected Nancy directly to the moment she vanished. At that point, the investigation shifted completely. This was no longer about finding someone who might be lost. It was about understanding what had been done and who had done it. Investigators began working outward from that point carefully because when a scene is this contained, every detail carries weight. Every object becomes a potential link, and one object in particular drew attention early. A glove found not far from the home, similar in appearance to what the masked individual had been wearing. For a moment, it looked like progress because physical evidence, especially something that can carry DNA, has the potential to change everything. It can connect a person to a place. It can turn an unknown figure into a known one. The glove was tested, analyzed, compared, and the result came back incomplete. No match, no direct connection, no clear answer. And just like that, momentum slowed. Not stopped but slowed because this is what real investigations often look like. Moments of possibility followed by moments of uncertainty, and each time that happens, something shifts not just in the investigation, but in the perception of it. Because from the outside, people expect movement to be visible. They expect progress to look like answers, but most of the time it does not. It looks like elimination. It looks like testing something and finding nothing. It looks like going back and trying again. At the same time, something else was building. Volume. Its attention. The case was no longer local. It had moved into the national space. And with that came something investigators always have to manage. Noise. Thousands of tips began coming in. Each one needing to be reviewed, each one needing to be considered because the cost of ignoring the right piece of information is too high. But the reality is most of those tips do not lead anywhere. Some are mistaken. Some are based on incomplete information. Some are simply wrong. And sorting through that takes time. Time that feels limited. Time that creates pressure. Because while investigators are working through that volume, the clock continues. And that is where the case begins to feel different. Because it is not just about what is happening. It is about how long it is taking. Days turn into weeks. Weeks begin to stretch. And the absence of resolution becomes part of the story itself. That is when the case begins to shift, not in evidence, but in perception. Because as time passes, people begin to look for something else, something new, something that explains why the case is still open. And that is where the messages begin to enter. At first, they followed a pattern. They were directed to the family. They carried specific demands, and in some cases, they included details that had not been made public. That alone made them difficult to ignore because information that is not publicly available suggests access. It suggests proximity. It suggests that whoever sent those messages may have known something real. Savannah Guthrie later stated that she believed those early messages were genuine, and that matters because families in situations like this often develop a sense of what feels real, what carries weight, what stands apart from everything else. Investigators also appeared to take those messages seriously, tracking financial paths, monitoring activity, trying to determine whether those communications could lead somewhere concrete. But even then, nothing resolved. No confirmed location, no recovery, no identification of who was responsible. And as time passed, something else happened. The pattern changed. New messages began to appear, but they were not the same. They were not directed to the family. They were sent elsewhere to media outlets. And the tone was different. The structure was different. The consistency began to break. What had once appeared controlled now felt unstable. And that shift introduced a new problem. Because now the case was not just dealing with evidence. It was dealing with claims, not just facts, but narratives. And those narratives did not align. One message would suggest one outcome. Another would contradict it. One would introduce a location. Another would change it. And over time, that instability began to grow. Because once a case reaches that level of attention, something else happens. People begin to insert themselves into it, not always with information, sometimes with intention. And that creates a second layer of complexity. Because now investigators are not just separating fact from unknown. They are separating fact from noise. And that is a different challenge entirely. Because noise does not just sit quietly. It moves, it spreads, it attracts attention, and it can pull focus away from what matters. At this stage, the investigation exists in two spaces. One is controlled, methodical, built on evidence. The other is public, unstable, driven by claims. And those two spaces do not always move together, which is why the case feels the way it does now. Not just unresolved, but divided between what is known and what keeps changing. By the time a case reaches this stage, the facts do not feel bigger. They feel farther away. Not because they changed, but because so much has been built around them. New notes, new claims, new voices, new theories, new pressure. And yet, when all of that is pulled back, the center of the Nancy Guthrie case is still the same small, brutal circle it was in the beginning. An 84-year-old woman last seen on January 31st after spending the evening with family in Tucson. A masked man at her front door camera in the early hours of February 1st. A pacemaker app losing contact about half an hour later. Blood on the porch later confirmed to be NY's. And then no arrest, no public suspect, and no recovery. That is what makes this case so haunting. It is not built on uncertainty alone. It is built on interruption. Yet Nancy did not seem to simply drift out of routine. The public record points the other way. Her family later said she failed to appear for church. Authorities moved quickly toward the belief that she had been taken against her will. The house and surrounding area were treated as a crime scene within days. Even before the later flood of notes and commentary, the structure of the case already suggested force, planning, and a narrow window in which something went terribly wrong. And that is why the case keeps returning to the beginning, because the beginning still holds the hardest truths. Whoever came to that house appears, from everything publicly reported, to have known enough to act with purpose. Reuters chronology says the figure on the doorbell footage was wearing a ski mask, backpack, gloves, and a holstered gun while tampering with the camera. AP later reported investigators were even working with Walmart after identifying the suspect's backpack as an Ozark Trail model. That level of focus tells you something. It tells you the investigation has not been moving through abstractions. It has been trying to build a real person from fragments. A bag, a gait, a posture, a sequence of movements, a narrow span of time before the signal from NY's pacemaker app went dark. But fragments are not the same as answers. That may be the hardest lesson in this entire story. Because from the outside, people often expect an investigation to look like momentum. A clue appears, then another, then a suspect, then an arrest. But in reality, investigations like this often move by resistance. A glove is found, and for a moment it looks promising. DNA is recovered, and for another moment, it seems even stronger. Then the national database comes back with no match. Then further testing traces the glove to a local restaurant employee who is cleared. What looked like progress becomes a dead end, and what looked like the face of the case becomes only another object lying quietly beside it. That is what long investigations do. They stretch emotion, they stretch patience, and they stretch the distance between what the public sees and what law enforcement is actually doing. AP reported that several hundred detectives and agents were assigned as the investigation expanded. Reuters reporting shows the case moving through evidence testing, ransom note deadlines, searches, and reward offers. So this was never a case without activity. It was a case without closure. There is a difference between those two things, and families live inside that difference every day. That is where Savannah Guthrie's role in the public story becomes so important. Because every time she appears, the case stops being a collection of clues and becomes a family emergency again. Reuters reported that she returned to the Today Show on April 6th, after more than 2 months away, and coverage of that return emphasized the emotion of the moment. Her family had already offered a reward of up to $1 million for information leading to NY's recovery, on top of the FBI reward already in place. That means the case is not just emotionally exposed. It is publicly escalated. It is a national missing person case with a 7-figure family reward, a federal reward, and in continuing appeals from NY's children. And still nothing has broken it open. That is where the newer notes become more disturbing than informative. Because when a family is already waiting in that kind of uncertainty, false certainty can be crueler than silence. Entertainment Weekly's reporting on Jennifer Coffindoffer's reaction captures that dynamic well. She said the timing of the latest notes sent the same day Savannah returned to work looked intentional, and she described the senders as scammers rather than credible informants. The notes reportedly claimed both that Nancy was dead and that she had been seen alive in Sonora, Mexico. Those are not small differences. They are not details that can be reconciled later. They are direct collisions at the center of the story. And once you reach direct contradiction, the question changes. It is no longer what are they trying to tell us. It becomes what are they trying to do. Because information that helps an investigation usually becomes more stable with scrutiny. It may start incomplete, but it tends to settle. It tends to sharpen. What has happened here appears to be the opposite. The later messages do not become clearer. They become noisier. They become more dramatic. They ask for less money than the total reward on the table, which Kafender pointed to as one reason she doubted them. If someone truly had actionable knowledge, why try to dodge the official route and settle for far less through media channels? That behavior does not read like confidence. It reads like urgency to be paid before the claim can be tested. But even if those later notes are noise, they still matter because noise can change the shape of a case in public. One note says, "Nancy is dead." And suddenly the emotional center shifts toward grief. Another says she was seen alive in Sonora, and the emotional center shifts back toward rescue. The public gets pulled from one edge to another. The family gets pulled with it, and investigators are forced to spend time separating performance from evidence because they cannot afford to ignore even information that looks unreliable if there is any chance it could matter. That is how noise does damage. It does not have to be believed by everyone. It only has to be loud enough to divide attention. And that brings the case to the Mexico question. Sonora is not an impossible place name in this story. It borders Arizona. The route south from Tucson is real. That is exactly why the reference is so powerful. It sounds close enough to be frightening, specific enough to feel plausible, and distant enough to suggest a trail that could have slipped, a movement tied to the route, a financial trail that opens instead of closes, a communication that does not contradict itself, a witness who does not surface through spectacle, but through something stable, testable, and hard to fake. Until that happens, the case will continue to live in this difficult space between urgency and uncertainty. And that is where the emotional toll really sits, because the public can step in and out of the story. The family cannot. For viewers, the case arrives in segments: a new note, a new interview, a return to television, a fresh appeal. For NY's children, there is no segment break. There is only continuation. A Reuters reported that the family's February 24th reward video addressed for the first time the possibility that Nancy could be dead. That single fact says more than most headlines ever could. It means they had already reached the point where hope and dread had to be spoken in the same breath. And yet they kept speaking. They kept asking. They kept making themselves visible. That matters because in a case like this, visibility is a form of resistance too. A refusal to let the victim become only a photo in a case file or a still image in a news package. Nancy remains present in this story because her children keep putting her there in their videos, in their appeals, in the reward, in Savannah's tears when she returned to work. And in every reminder that this is not just an unsolved investigation, but a missing mother whose absence is still active, still daily, still unfinished. So where does that leave the case now? Not at an ending, and not even really at a turn. It leaves it at a narrowing. The false notes seem, at least from current reporting, easier to recognize as false. The later contradictions have become their own warning sign. The real work appears to remain where it always was. In the earliest window, the earliest evidence, the earliest movement around the house, and the earliest communications that did not yet feel contaminated by attention. That is where the case still seems most likely to answer itself, and that may be the final shape of this story for now. Not that the truth is missing, but that it is buried under too many other things trying to look like it. A mask on a doorstep, a camera going dark, a medical signal dropping out, a porch that did not stay clean, a pair of gloves that led nowhere, a family forced to offer more and more just to keep hope moving, a public desperate for a breakthrough, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, a woman whose last ordinary evening has still not been returned to a known ending. That is why this case continues to hold people, because it is not only frightening, it is unfinished in a way that feels intimate. A home was crossed, a routine was broken, and everything since then has been an attempt to understand the silence that followed. For now, that silence is still there. But it is not empty. It is full of evidence, full of pressure, full of grief, and full of a single unanswered demand that every part of this case keeps circling back to whoever came to Nancy Guthrie's house that night, knew enough to act. The question is whether investigators are one step away from proving who that was, or whether the case is still waiting for the one detail that finally stops moving and holds.